Today we're going to read chapter 14 of Someone Was Watching. Thursday morning came early for Chris. It was still dark in his room when he woke from a series of short, restless naps, his stomach in a knot. He felt as if he were facing a day or several days that could turn out to be either like Christmas or a trip to the dentist to have every tooth in his mouth pulled without Novocaine. There probably wouldn't be any in between. They'd either find her or they'd find out how foolish they'd been. He didn't even want to think about the kinds of trouble they'd get in on the way to either alternative. And then they'd have to come back and face their parents, if they made it back. He looked at the clock. 5:08. He hoped it was later. He wondered if Pat was awake yet, and decided he must be. Pat's nerves had been showing through his skin last night as they paced around the neighborhood like two cats with their fur on fire. Chris had figured then that neither of them would get much sleep, although he knew they both needed it. Now he had to lie here and stare at the ceiling for the next 2 hours. He couldn't risk getting up, not yet. A suspicious mom and dad was the last thing he needed. 2 hours later, he sat at his desk listening to his parents' hushed voices. Drifting up the stairs, he signed, "Love, Chris," at the bottom of the note he'd just written and read it silently to himself. "Dear Mom and Dad," it began. "Pat and I have gone to look for Molly. We think we know where she is. We think she's not at the bottom of the river. It shouldn't take long to find out if we're right. We'll be back in a couple of days. Watch the video again. Think about what we told you. It's spooky. We have to check it out, but we'll be careful. I'll call you." It looked about right. Enough information, but not too much. He didn't want people chasing after them before he and Pat had a chance to find out what they needed to find out. He folded the note in thirds, wrote Mom and Dad on the outside, and tucked it into his desk drawer. His parents looked up at him and smiled when he walked into the kitchen. Surprised, but not suspicious. Good, he thought. He'd considered staying in his bedroom until after they left for work so their suspicions wouldn't get stirred up, but he wanted to see them. He needed to see them. "What's up, Chris?" his dad asked. What does he mean by that? Chris thought. "Nothing much," he said. "Some barking dog woke me up and I couldn't get back to sleep. Then I smelled food down here." He eyed the omelet and cantaloupe sitting on his mom's plate. "This is mine, you little beggar," she said, smiling and grabbing onto her plate with both hands, as if Chris were going to pounce on it from 10 feet away. His dad laughed. "I'll make you one too, Chris," he said, getting up from the table. "I don't think you're going to talk your mom out of hers." A half hour later, Chris watched them pull out of the driveway. Pat's parents would have left a few minutes earlier. They always did. Chris was waiting outside the front door when Pat arrived 5 minutes later, red-faced and out of breath. "You ready?" Pat asked. "I think so," Chris said. He had left the note in the middle of the kitchen table. "Tickets, money, map, clothes," Pat said. Chris nodded. The tickets and clothes were in the backpack. He'd split the money up between his wallet, his socks, and the backpack's zippered inside pocket. "How about you? You got everything? Your money, change for bus fare?" "I checked about 10 times, Pat said. "Did you leave your parents a note?" "Yeah," Pat replied, swallowing hard. "I told them what, but not where." Chris checked the front door to make sure it was locked. "Let's go then," he said, looking at his watch. "We've only got about 10 minutes before the next bus." They left the yard at a fast walk. 2 boys in t-shirts and jeans, each with a small pack on his back, looking as if they were heading off to the park for the day. They covered the 3 blocks to the bus stop in a hurry. The bus was crowded with people on their way to work downtown. Chris stood in the aisle next to Pat and watched people napping over the morning paper. He imagined the headlines reading, "Local boys missing, feared dead." A shudder shot through him. He looked at Pat for comfort, but Pat was in a world of his own, his eyes darting around at the bus. "Looking for spies again, Pat?" he asked softly. "These people are just pretending to be going to work," Pat whispered with a nervous grin. "We both know they're spies and who they're following." "I don't think they'd follow us very fast," Chris said. "They look like they're in a coma." "They're pretending." Chris nodded toward the 2-person seat next to Pat where a fat woman sat by herself. She was slumped over in the seat with her eyes closed, breathing heavily, a magazine propped up over one side of her face to block out the sun. "She's doing a good job of pretending," Chris said, and they both laughed. None of the other passengers even looked up. Once downtown, they made a quick connection with the bus to Mitchellfield. It wasn't as crowded, and they found seats toward the back. Looking out the window, Chris was reminded of the trip to Greenwater. It already seemed like a long time ago. Chris and Pat had both been to the airport with their parents before, but they agreed that it seemed bigger now and less friendly. They found the Central Express ticketing area and looked on the overhead monitor to check for Flight 151 to Tampa. It was departing on time from Gate 22. Since they already had their tickets and they had no baggage to check, they skipped the line at the ticket counter and headed for the gate. 5 minutes later, they'd gone through the security area and were standing at the check-in counter for Flight 151. So far, so good. But Chris's nerves were telling him otherwise. He felt as if he were 5 years old again in a classroom full of strangers on his first day of school, watching his mom walk away and leave him. "Do you gentlemen have a seating preference?" the young man behind the counter asked as Chris handed him the tickets. His name tag said J. Miller. Chris wasn't sure what that meant. He waited for Pat to say something, but Pat didn't seem to know what the guy was talking about either. Pat looked at Chris. "I don't know," he said. "Do you have one?" "Not really," Chris said, glancing back at J. Miller, who looked amused. "We're not very full this morning," J. Miller said, checking his computer. "I can give you window seats, aisle seats, just about anything you want. What sounds good?" "A window," Chris said. He wanted to see where they were going. "Just put me next to him," Pat said. "Row 19 okay?" J. Miller said, grinning. "Sure," Pat said. Chris had no idea where row 19 was, and he doubted that Pat did either, but at least they were about finished. J. Miller seemed like a nice guy, but his smile was making Chris even more nervous. "So, which one of you is Rocky Sims?" J. Miller said, his pen poised over the ticket packet. Pat hesitated and then held out his hand for the ticket and boarding pass. "Not sure, huh?" J. Miller said, still grinning. He marked the seat number on the pass and handed the packet to Pat. "Keep smiling," Chris thought. "Keep thinking we're just a couple of ignorant kids." "He just daydreams a lot," Chris said, reaching for the other ticket folder. "Let's go, Rocky." They headed for seats by the big window where they could watch the planes take off and land. "Have a good flight," J. Miller called after them. "Thanks," they both replied. Chris was shaking his head as they sat down. "Rocky Sims," he said under his breath. "What a dumb name. And the least you could do is recognize it when somebody talks to you." "I like it," Pat said indignantly. "And besides, I was nervous." "About what?" Chris said, trying to sound calm. "You know why, Fred," Pat said, lowering his voice. "Speaking of dumb names, Fred Barnes." "Can I help it if I grew up watching the Flintstones?" Chris whispered. "It's good enough to keep people off our tails if they decide to check the airlines." Chris hoped it would be anyway, at least for a few days. Chris watched Pat rummage through his backpack and pull out 2 bananas. He offered one to Chris, who shook his head no. His stomach was full of butterflies, and they were getting more active. Planning this trip had brought out one set of emotions. Actually going on it was allowing a different group to surface. Fear and doubt were right up near the top. The big plane was only half full. Pat and Chris's seats were midway back on the right side. There were no passengers on the 6 other seats in their row, which stretched across the plane and was divided by 2 aisles. Chris was glad for the space. He hadn't been looking forward to lying to more people about where they were going and why. He was thinking of the why part when the plane inched away from the terminal. He watched Pat check his seatbelt and grip the armrests. "Don't fall out," he said to him in his most sincere voice. Pat ignored him. Chris went back to his thinking, looking out the window at the pavement, drifting slowly past. Suddenly, they were accelerating down the runway. A moment later, they lifted off. The plane gained altitude and banked to the right, and for an instant Chris felt as if they were about to slide back to Earth. But then the plane righted itself and continued up. Below him, Chris saw the city, and then it was gone. And they were climbing through cotton ball clouds, and he was still thinking about why they were going. He figured that he'd stayed focused on that, on finding Molly and bringing her back, and he'd be able to keep the feeling in the pit of his stomach under control. If he could just concentrate on where they were going, the journey there might not seem so scary. But right now he was scared, not only of what lay ahead, but also of what he'd left behind. What were his parents going to think? What were they going to feel? He looked down at a puffy blanket of clouds, and suddenly he felt exhausted. Suddenly he couldn't keep his eyes open. He let them close and drifted off, still thinking about Molly. "Chris," he heard someone say through a fog. He opened his eyes and glanced around, not sure where he was at first. Then he remembered. He looked at Pat, who was staring at him with a funny expression on his face. "Did you say something?" Chris said. "You've been in a trance," Pat asked. "I tried talking to you a couple of times before I figured out you were asleep. You tired?" "Just thinking," Chris said. "What did you say?" "Nothing much. I was just saying that things are going okay so far. I mean, we made it on the plane and everything. I think it's even the right plane." "I hope so," Chris said. Pat was right. So far, things had gone okay. So far, they'd been able to avoid trouble. He wondered how long that would last. He looked up to see the flight attendants approaching with a cart. He didn't feel hungry, but he might as well try to eat something. He wasn't sure when they'd get another chance, and this food was already paid for. They ate their meal quietly. Chris picked at his food and stared at the countryside flowing by far below. Serpentine rivers, straight arrow highways, crisscrossing in perfect clover leaves, forests and lakes, mile after mile of brown and green fields in squares and rectangles and circles, and here and there a small town or a range of hills rising above the plain. After the flight attendant took the remains of their food, the boys lay back in their seats and dozed off. When Chris jump-started himself awake, the plane was in its descent, but a dream had awakened him. A dream of Molly standing in a green rectangular field and waving to him. He looked out the window. The terrain had changed. There were no more fields, not the same kind anyway. The ground below looked green and boggy, and lakes and swamps and narrow paths of water dotted and stripped the land. Florida. Somewhere over Florida.